My cheating wife and her brother stole my flagship restaurant, so I faked a catastrophic health crisis and left them with millions in debt. I'm 38 years old. I have spent my entire adult life working incredibly grueling, 90-hour weeks inside boiling hot commercial kitchens. I'm an executive chef, and my entire world revolves around absolute precision, extreme discipline, and culinary perfection. My wife Elena was a charming front-of-house manager when we first met exactly 10 years ago. She was incredibly charismatic, but she came with a massive, entirely toxic anchor tied to her ankle. Her older brother, David. David fancied himself a massive hospitality mogul. In reality, he was a completely failed promoter who owned three entirely bankrupt, incredibly sleazy nightclubs on the edge of town. He was an incredibly arrogant man who leased luxury imported vehicles while drowning in massive corporate debt. David constantly looked down on me. He told Elena that I was just a glorified line cook who would spend my entire life working for other people. I mostly just ignored his massive ego, kept my head down, and saved every single penny I earned. Exactly 3 years ago, my massive, lifelong culinary dream finally came true. I found a completely dilapidated, historically protected commercial building in the absolute center of the city's wealthiest district. I drained my entire life savings, withdrawing exactly $1,200,000 in pure cash. I bought the physical building entirely outright, and I spent another 8 months completely renovating it into a massive, world-class fine dining establishment. Because I put up 100% of the capital and assumed all the massive financial risk, the physical deed to the building and the master operating licenses were registered solely in my individual name. The restaurant was an absolute overnight triumph. Within exactly 6 months, we received a massive, internationally recognized culinary award. We were booked out for exactly 4 entire months in advance. We were pulling in exactly $150,000 a month in pure, unadulterated profit. But David was incredibly, sickeningly jealous of my massive success. He constantly badgered me to let him take over the entire beverage program, demanding a massive 30% cut of my total revenue. I told him absolutely, unequivocally no. I told him my flagship restaurant was not one of his sleazy nightclubs, and he was entirely banned from interfering with my business. Elena defended him. We had massive, completely exhausting arguments about it. But I held my absolute boundary, entirely refusing to let David anywhere near my finances. I had absolutely no idea that my wife and her deeply arrogant brother were actively, methodically plotting to completely steal my entire life's work right out from under my nose. Exactly 3 weeks ago, I was invited to fly to Paris, France to consult on a massive, highly prestigious international culinary event. I was scheduled to be completely out of the country for exactly 14 days. Elena drove me to the airport. She hugged me tightly, told me how incredibly proud she was, and promised to keep an eye on the restaurant while I was gone. I worked exhausting 18-hour shifts in Paris. The event actually finished a full 2 days early. Because I was completely exhausted, I didn't text Elena my updated flight itinerary. I just boarded a red-eye flight, landed in the city, and took a quiet taxi cab directly back to our massive suburban house on a Tuesday morning. The house was completely empty. Elena was out running errands. I dropped my heavy luggage in the hallway and walked straight into my home office to file my international travel receipts in my heavy mahogany desk. I opened the bottom drawer, and my heart instantly stopped beating in my chest. Hidden all the way in the absolute back, completely buried underneath old tax returns, was a thick, newly printed legal envelope from a highly aggressive commercial real estate broker. I pulled the heavy envelope out and opened it, and the absolute catastrophic reality of my wife's entirely sociopathic betrayal completely shattered my universe. It was a finalized, legally binding corporate buyout agreement. Elena and David hadn't just plotted against me. They had completely, maliciously hired a corrupt commercial notary to forge my absolute legal signature on a massive stack of state documents. Using the forged paperwork, Elena had officially transferred my 100% ownership of the physical building, the liquor licenses, and the master operating permits directly into a completely new holding company controlled entirely by David. But the most absolutely sickening part was the massive financial transaction printed on the second page. David had leveraged his remaining nightclub assets to secure a massive corporate loan. He had used that loan to officially buy the restaurant from my forged proxy, and he had already wired exactly $800,000 into a completely secret, offshore bank account registered solely in Elena's name. They had literally stolen my flagship restaurant. They forged federal tax documents, completely bypassed my ownership, and Elena had pocketed nearly $1 million in pure stolen cash. Based on the printed timeline, they were planning to legally lock me out of my own kitchen the exact day I returned from Europe, leaving me with absolutely nothing. I sat in my quiet home office, staring at the forged signature on the massive corporate contract. They thought I was just a completely exhausted chef who only understood food. They thought they had committed the absolute perfect untraceable corporate theft while I was an ocean away. I didn't panic. I didn't smash anything in the office. My absolute cold kitchen discipline immediately took over my entire brain. I carefully took high-resolution photographs of every single forged document, every single routing number, and the sleazy broker's contact information. I put the envelope exactly back where I found it, entirely undisturbed. I grabbed my heavy luggage, walked right back out the front door, and checked into an expensive downtown hotel. I wasn't just going to file a massive civil lawsuit. I was going to legally trap them in a massive, completely inescapable nightmare that would utterly destroy their entire arrogant existence. I did not immediately charge back to our suburban home to confront my treacherous wife. When you run a Michelin-level kitchen, you learn an incredibly vital lesson about crisis management. When a grease fire breaks out on the cooking line, you do not throw water on it and scream. You entirely cut off the oxygen, step back, and systematically smother the flames. I spent the next 2 days completely isolated in my downtown hotel room, meticulously crafting my counterattack. I contacted my private business attorney, a brilliant, soft-spoken woman who had helped me navigate the grueling municipal zoning laws when I first bought the restaurant. I invited her to my hotel suite and laid the high-resolution photographs of the forged corporate buyout entirely across the glass table. She reviewed the fraudulent signatures, traced the offshore banking route, and let out a long, heavy sigh. She informed me that Elena and David had committed a staggering array of commercial felonies. By forging state liquor licenses and transferring the deed of a historically protected building to secure an $800,000 corporate loan, they were guilty of massive grand larceny, identity theft, and federal wire fraud. My attorney reached into her purse for her phone. She told me we could have the district attorney issue arrest warrants for both of them before dinner service even began. I gently shook my head and asked her to put the phone away. I told her I did not want them sitting in a holding cell while my flagship restaurant was tied up in a massive, multi-year probate investigation. I wanted the business legally, cleanly returned to my name. I wanted my wife to willingly, frantically rip up her own stolen payday. And I wanted to watch her brother's massive, unearned ego completely shatter into a million pieces. My attorney listened to my strategy, a slow smile spreading across her face. She called it a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Because I am an executive chef, I'm intimately familiar with the terrifying, labyrinthine regulations of the Department of Public Health and the Center for Disease Control. I have endured hundreds of rigorous health inspections. I know the exact formatting, the alarming red biological hazard stamps, and the profoundly devastating legal terminology the federal government uses to permanently condemn a commercial food facility. I opened my laptop and spent exactly 12 uninterrupted hours drafting a flawless 90-page joint federal mandate from the Center for Disease Control and the Environmental Protection Agency. The document looked absolutely horrifying. It detailed a catastrophic, entirely fabricated public health emergency. The fake mandate claimed that the historical building's ancient underlying plumbing architecture had suffered a massive, completely undetected structural failure. It stated that highly toxic industrial-grade sewage had aggressively cross-contaminated the restaurant's main water filtration system. The document declared that a completely untreatable, highly lethal bacterial pathogen had infected hundreds of high-profile patrons over the last 2 months, resulting in massive critical hospitalizations. The fake federal order permanently revoked all operating licenses and declared the physical building a catastrophic biological hazard that required immediate, mandatory demolition and deep soil excavation. But the absolute lethal poison was buried directly on page 7. I wrote a highly specific clause stating that whoever currently held the active corporate deed to the property was completely personally liable for an immediate federal public health fine of exactly $22 million to cover the municipal cleanup and the impending class action medical lawsuits. Furthermore, the document explicitly stated that any financial proxy attempting to sell, transfer, or abandon the condemned property would face a mandatory minimum sentence of exactly 40 years in a federal penitentiary for criminal biological negligence. It was an inescapable, profoundly terrifying trap. I printed the enormous stack of papers, slid them into a heavy yellow folder stamped with fake biohazard warnings, and initiated my performance. On Thursday afternoon, I purchased a cheap burner phone and called Elena. I kept my voice incredibly hoarse, entirely breathless, and completely panicked. I told her I was stranded at a downtown hotel because federal health authorities had intercepted me at the airport and placed me under temporary observation. I told her she needed to come to my room completely immediately. Elena arrived exactly 45 minutes later. She looked entirely composed, carrying her expensive designer handbag, totally prepared to play the loving wife welcoming her successful husband home from Paris. I opened the hotel door. I had completely soaked my shirt in warm water to simulate nervous sweating. I left the curtains drawn, keeping the room in heavy shadows. I completely ignored her attempt to hug me. I stumbled backward, collapsed onto the edge of the hotel bed, and dropped the heavy yellow folder directly onto the floor between us. Elena, I whispered, letting a fake, agonizing sob escape my throat. The restaurant is entirely gone. We are completely, permanently ruined. Her confident facade vanished instantly. She dropped her designer bag and asked me what I was talking about. I looked up at her, forcing my eyes to appear entirely wild with terror. I told her the federal government was permanently seizing the physical building. I told her about the lethal bacterial pathogen, the toxic sewage leak, and the massive critical hospitalizations. I told her the restaurant had to be completely demolished by hazardous materials teams. Elena stared at me, blinking rapidly, completely unable to process the scale of the disaster. And then, I twisted the blade. The worst part, I gasped, clutching my chest, is the massive federal liability. The health inspectors told me that whoever legally owns the deed to that building is going to be personally, financially ruined. They are issuing a mandatory cleanup fine of exactly $22 million. And because my name is on the physical deed, the federal prosecutors are going to send me to a maximum security penitentiary for 40 entire years. I watched the realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. The color completely, entirely drained from her face. Her skin turned a terrifying shade of pale gray. She realized in that exact horrifying fraction of a second that she had just voluntarily forged federal documents to transfer the deed of a $22 million biological hazard directly into her arrogant brother's name. She realized that by securing that $800,000 commercial loan, she had just legally signed her brother up for 40 years in federal prison and implicated herself in massive criminal negligence. She did not try to comfort me. She did not ask if I was feeling sick. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own expensive shoes. She muttered that she was having a panic attack and needed to use the restroom. She practically sprinted across the hotel suite, slammed the heavy bathroom door, and threw the deadbolt. I stood up from the bed, my tears vanishing instantly. I walked silently across the carpeted floor and pressed my ear against the painted wood. Elena was hyperventilating so violently she was practically choking. She had immediately called David. "David, you have to fix this right now." Elena screamed, entirely sobbing into her cell phone. "The federal government is demolishing the restaurant. It is a massive biological hazard. The federal health inspectors are charging the legal owner of the building $22 million in municipal fines. If they find out you hold the corporate deed, you're going to federal prison for 40 years. We have to rip up the buyout. We have to give the building entirely back to him before the federal prosecutors trace the offshore money." I stood in the dim shadows of the hotel room, a completely cold, satisfied smile spreading across my face. The bait was swallowed whole. The terror was absolute. And they were about to willingly, frantically tear their own fraudulent empire entirely to shreds. I remained perfectly still in the shadowy corridor of the hotel suite, pressing my palm firmly against my mouth to stifle the laughter bubbling up in my chest. Through the solid oak door, the sound of my wife and her deeply arrogant brother completely unraveling was absolute music to my ears. Elena was gasping for breath, frantically repeating the entirely fabricated, apocalyptic health violations I had just spoon-fed her. She sobbed uncontrollably about spending exactly 40 years in a federal penitentiary and facing a crushing $22 million biological hazard fine. After about 15 minutes of listening to her completely melt down, I stepped away from the door, returned to the edge of the mattress, and buried my face in my hands. I slipped effortlessly back into the persona of the ruined, terrified executive chef. The bathroom door finally clicked open. Elena emerged looking like a ghost of her former glamorous self. Her expensive mascara was smeared down her cheeks, her hands trembled violently, and she looked as though she had aged a decade in a matter of minutes. She crossed the room, sank to her knees on the hotel carpet right in front of me, and grasped my wrists. Her skin was freezing cold. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, and fed me the most incredibly transparent, poorly constructed lie I had ever been forced to endure. "Darling," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "I have to confess something. I did something incredibly foolish exactly 3 weeks ago, but I only did it because a wealth management consultant told me it would protect us from massive municipal liabilities." I widened my eyes, playing the role of the utterly confused husband. She took a deep, shuddering breath and continued her pathetic fabrication. She claimed she had been deeply worried about the restaurant's aging infrastructure. She said she wanted to shield my personal finances by temporarily shifting the corporate deed into a massive holding company managed by her brother. And then she confessed to the actual crime, wrapping it in a sickening facade of wifely devotion. "I forged your signature to transfer the property," she wept, squeezing my wrists tight. "We secured an $800,000 commercial loan to prepare for massive renovations. I was just trying to protect your beautiful culinary dream. But now, the federal government has David listed as the sole proprietor of a biological hazard." I tore my wrists from her grasp. I stood up, towering over her kneeling form, and delivered a masterclass in theatrical panic. I began pacing the length of the hotel suite, tearing at my hair. I shouted that she had committed a catastrophic federal offense. I told her that because she had attached a massive commercial loan to a condemned toxic property, the federal prosecutors were going to arrest her brother for biological terrorism and criminal negligence before the weekend was even over. Elena completely shattered. She curled into a ball on the carpet, sobbing hysterically. She begged for my forgiveness and pleaded with me to find a solution. We have to reverse the corporate transfer. Elena shrieked, looking up at me with sheer terror. David is driving to the commercial broker's office right this exact second. We have to wire the entire sum of money back to the lender and dissolve the holding company before the federal health inspectors trace the offshore accounts. Exactly 40 minutes later, the door to the hotel suite burst open. David rushed inside. The slick, arrogant nightclub mogul was entirely gone. In his place was a completely pale, hyperventilating mess of a man, sweating profusely through his expensive designer suit and clutching a leather briefcase to his chest. He completely bypassed any pleasantries, ignoring me entirely to scream directly at his sister. "We have to invalidate this deed immediately." David roared, his voice cracking with panic. "I am not going down for a massive public health disaster. I am not spending 40 years in a federal penitentiary because your husband's restaurant poisoned half the city." I simply nodded, maintaining my facade of absolute defeat. I informed them that if they did not completely reverse the massive commercial loan and legally dissolve the fraudulent holding company within the hour, the federal authorities would permanently freeze all of their personal assets. David nearly dropped his briefcase. He admitted right there in my hotel room that the massive $800,000 wire transfer had already cleared into Elena's offshore account. "You have to send every single penny back," I yelled, perfectly mimicking a man pushed to the absolute brink. "If you retain a single cent of that fraudulent loan, the government will charge you both with international money laundering." David did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He pulled out his phone, dialed his high-risk corporate banker, and frantically authorized an immediate wire reversal back to the commercial lender. I stood in the center of the room and listened as he completely drained the offshore account. Because emergency international wire reversals of that magnitude carry astronomical penalty fees, David willingly paid exactly $95,000 out of his own depleted nightclub funds just to return the $800,000 to the bank. He utterly bankrupted himself out of sheer, unadulterated terror. I told them we needed to leave for the corrupt commercial broker's office entirely immediately. We drove in separate vehicles. I followed closely behind his leased luxury car, watching in my rearview mirror as they drove erratically through the city, utterly desperate to shed the massive federal liability. We arrived at the sleazy commercial real estate office exactly 1 hour later. The corrupt broker looked absolutely terrified when David burst through the glass doors and slammed his briefcase onto the desk. David demanded that the broker print a massive, legally binding document entirely dissolving the fraudulent holding company and completely removing his name from the restaurant's deed. Because the massive funds had already cleared the wire reversal, the broker did not dare argue. He saw the pure, unhinged panic in David and Elena's eyes, and he produced the legal deed release documents immediately. Elena and David did not even bother to read the dense stack of paperwork. Their hands trembled so violently they could barely hold the heavy ink pens. They were entirely convinced that federal hazardous materials teams were going to kick down the doors at any second. They signed their names rapidly. They legally, officially dissolved the entire massive holding company. They completely surrendered any and all financial claims to the physical building, effectively returning the master deed and all operating licenses entirely into my sole name. The corrupt broker stamped the documents with his heavy official seal, officially validating the complete reversal. I reached across the desk and picked up the heavy legal folder containing the freshly signed property release documents. I inspected the fresh black ink. I felt the physical weight of the folder in my hands. The entire Flagship restaurant, the massive historical building, and my culinary legacy were completely, entirely mine again. No forged holding companies. No secret commercial loans. I slowly tucked the heavy folder securely under my arm. And then, the entire atmosphere in the sleazy broker's office completely, instantly shifted. I stopped looking like a terrified, broken chef. I squared my shoulders, entirely dropping the frantic, panicked breathing. I stood up perfectly straight, completely adjusted my jacket, and looked down at my entirely treacherous wife and her completely ruined brother. I just smiled. A completely cold, entirely merciless smile. And then, I dropped the absolute, final hammer on their entirely fabricated reality. I stood up perfectly straight, meticulously adjusted the cuffs of my jacket, and looked down at my deeply treacherous wife and her profoundly ruined brother. I just smiled. A chilling, entirely merciless smile. The heavy atmosphere inside that sleazy, fluorescent-lit commercial real estate office shifted in a single, staggering instant. I no longer resembled a terrified, broken executive chef teetering on the edge of a nervous breakdown. I squared my shoulders. I steadied my breathing. The facade was officially dropped. Elena looked up at me from the cheap leather guest chair. Her smeared, tear-stained eyes narrowed just a fraction of an inch. Her survival instincts were finally kicking in, signaling that something was fundamentally, irreparably wrong with this picture. "What? What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling violently in the quiet room. "Why are you looking at me like that? We have to get out of here and call the federal health inspectors. We have to prove to them that the holding company is dissolved so we do not go to prison." I let out a very slow, profoundly calm sigh. There are no federal health inspectors, Elena, I said, my voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. The three people in the room froze as if they had been struck by lightning. The corrupt real estate broker literally stopped breathing behind his desk. David's jaw dropped open, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock. I looked right into Elena's terrified eyes, and I systematically dismantled her entire fabricated universe. There is no classified biological hazard investigation, I explained, keeping my tone incredibly flat and unwavering. There is no toxic sewage leak in the historical plumbing. There is absolutely no $22 million municipal cleanup fine, and nobody is going to a federal penitentiary for 40 years. I invented the entire mandate from thin air. Elena stopped breathing. She stared at me, utterly unable to process the staggering truth rolling off my tongue. I tapped the heavy legal folder containing the freshly signed deed releases securely tucked under my arm. I'm an executive chef, I told her, my voice dripping with profound disgust. Did you honestly, truly believe you could secretly forge my signature on state liquor licenses, leverage my flagship restaurant for an $800,000 commercial loan, wire the money to a secret offshore account, and I would just stay in Paris and remain blissfully ignorant? I found the corporate buyout envelope in the bottom drawer of my desk on Tuesday morning. I saw the forged signatures. I traced the banking route. David started stammering uncontrollably. His face morphed into a violent, sickening shade of crimson. The realization of what I had just orchestrated slammed into his arrogant brain. He realized I had just legally tricked him into wiring nearly $1 million back to a commercial lender, paying an astronomical $95,000 wire penalty fee entirely out of his own depleted nightclub funds and willingly tearing up his own fraudulent deed. He lunged forward, screaming like a wounded animal. He reached across the broker's desk, desperately trying to snatch the heavy legal folder right out from under my arm. "You set us up," David roared, his voice cracking with undeniable rage. "You are a profoundly sick, twisted monster. That was a legally binding corporate transition. Give those deed release papers back right this exact second." I easily stepped back, keeping entirely out of his frantic reach. "No," I said quietly. "It was a staggering felony-level corporate crime. You forged municipal documents. You committed massive grand larceny and wire fraud. And because you were in such a profoundly blind, terrifying panic over a ghost, you just legally signed away every single shred of the culinary empire you thought you had stolen." I shifted my gaze directly to the deeply uncomfortable, sweating commercial broker. "And if any of you attempt to fight me on this," I said, making absolutely certain the corrupt broker heard my declaration, "I possess high-resolution photographs of the originally forged buyout agreements. I have the state license histories. I have the offshore wire transfer routing numbers. I will take every single piece of undeniable evidence straight to the district attorney, and I will make absolutely sure that all three of you actually go to a federal penitentiary for real." Elena let out this agonizing, blood-curdling groan. She buried her face in her hands and collapsed forward. She realized she had just legally confessed to a massive felony, lost a free $800,000 payday, and destroyed her entire 12-year marriage in one single catastrophic afternoon. I looked down at her violently shaking silhouette. "I'm filing for divorce the exact second the civil courthouse opens on Monday morning," I told her. "Do not bother returning to our suburban home. Your expensive designer bags and your jewelry are already sitting in heavy black trash bags at the edge of the driveway. And if you ever, even for a single passing second, try to come after my restaurant or my personal savings in the settlement, I will make the felony wire fraud charges officially binding." I did not wait for her pathetic apologies. I did not listen to David's unhinged screaming. I turned on my heel, walked out of the sleazy broker's office, got into a waiting taxi, and drove away into the evening. The legal and personal fallout over the following 8 months was undeniably brutal for my treacherous wife and her arrogant brother. Because I held the absolute concrete proof of their staggering felony forgery, Elena did not dare fight me in the divorce proceedings. She did not hire an aggressive family lawyer. She did not demand a single penny of my business revenue, and she absolutely did not try to claim any equity in the $1,200,000 commercial building. She signed the divorce papers quietly, absolutely terrified that I was going to send her to prison if she pushed back. She walked away from a remarkably comfortable, secure life with absolutely nothing but the clothes in her garbage bags. David's entire life catastrophically imploded because he had frantically reversed the massive commercial wire transfer and drained his remaining liquidity to pay the $95,000 penalty fee. His failing nightclubs died instantly. He could not pay his distributors, his liquor licenses were revoked for unpaid taxes, and his creditors seized his leased luxury vehicles. I heard through the local hospitality grapevine that they are both profoundly miserable. Because they lost the stolen money and the nightclubs collapsed, they turned on each other viciously. Elena blames David for convincing her to steal the building in the first place. David blames Elena for completely caving under pressure and confessing to the fabricated health inspectors. They absolutely despise each other. David had to move into a tiny, run-down apartment above a laundromat. Elena, who fancied herself a wealthy hospitality mogul's wife, is currently working as a minimum-wage hostess at a terrible, low-end chain restaurant just to pay for her groceries. As for me, my life is undeniably incredible. I kept my flagship restaurant and the historically protected building. The business is more successful than I could have ever imagined. We recently earned our second major international culinary award, and we are completely booked out for a full 12 months in advance. I am pulling in well over $200,000 a month, and I do not have to share a single cent of it with toxic, greedy in-laws. I sleep incredibly peacefully in my quiet home. I spend my days creating culinary masterpieces, entirely safe from any parasitic partners. I learned a staggering, invaluable lesson. The absolute most effective way to completely destroy an arrogant, entitled thief is not to scream at them or try to appeal to their non-existent morality. The greatest method is to weaponize their own suffocating terror, step entirely out of the way, and watch them legally, frantically dismantle their own existence.